Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Pill Policy, the Political Patient episode. As part of a collaboration with the American Heart Association, today we have a special episode with two guest speakers, Ms. Allison Perrone and Ms. Kristen Fitzgerald. To begin with, Ms. Allison Perrone has worked for the last 17 years as the Government Relations Director, Senior Regional Lead for the American Heart and American Stroke Association. Her role is to manage, plan, direct, and implement the advocacy programs to influence local, state, and national public issues related to the American Heart Association's mission in Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire. It's obviously a very distinguished professional. Ms. Kristen Fitzgerald is with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. She's been with them since 2001. Most of that time has been spent working to adapt hazardous waste regulations to specific sectors, including the healthcare industry and academic laboratories. So today we're going to be discussing nicotine disposal as evidenced by the picture on the screen. And we'll also be talking about the associated legislation and lobbying. And so the first set of questions we have today is for Kristen. So Kristen, could you please explain what the Resource Conservation Recovery Act is, or the RCRA for short?
Sure. Thank you, Anusha. Thanks very much for having me today. So before I answer your question, I just want to say, EPA is probably not the first agency that you think of when you think of regulating nicotine e-cigarettes in particular. So it's really good for us to have this opportunity to let people know that EPA does have hazardous waste regulations that apply to the disposal of e-cigarettes. So to answer your question, though, RCRA is what we usually say, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, RCRA for short. That's the law that, among other things, governs the disposal of waste. It's been around actually since 1976, 46 years old, probably a lot longer than most of your listeners have been around. Anyway, I work on the part of RCRA that governs disposal of hazardous waste, which is known as Subtitle C of RCRA. And I'm guessing that most of you, most people have not heard of RCRA, but they probably have heard of Superfund. And Superfund is for cleaning up old, contaminated, abandoned sites. I think of RCRA as kind of the partner legislation to Superfund. So RCRA is a preventative program that mandates what we refer to as the cradle to grave management of hazardous waste, with the idea being that we're preventing new Superfund sites from being created. So as with almost all environmental statutes, the federal regulations set a floor. That is, it's a minimum standard that applies to safely managing hazardous waste. And states must have regulations that are at least as stringent as EPA, but they may be more stringent, and in fact, some states are. So with that background on the RCRA statute or the law, let me just jump into a little bit of an introduction about the regulations, the RCRA regulations that implement the law. Okay, so the first thing I usually tell people about RCRA that you need to know is that the answer to almost any question about RCRA is it depends. So the first thing that it depends on is, well, I guess, let me back up a second. The second thing you need to know about is that once an item is discarded and becomes a waste, and that question is actually a very complicated question about whether something is in fact a waste. But let's assume for the purpose of this discussion that it is a waste. Whether and how RCRA applies depends on several things. So first, who's generating the waste? So if you and I generate a waste at our homes and it's a hazardous waste, it's not actually regulated as a hazardous waste. Okay, and we can talk more about this later. But if the exact same waste is generated at a non-residence, like a business or a school, for example, then it is regulated when it's disposed of. All right, so it's who is generating the hazardous waste is kind of the first question. Is it a residence or a non-residence? Let's say the waste is actually generated by non-residents. Okay, then whether and how RCRA applies depends on two more things. One is what type of waste is it? And there are acute hazardous wastes and there are non-acute hazardous wastes. So acute wastes are regulated more stringently at lower amounts. And spoiler alert here, nicotine is an acute hazardous waste. The other thing it depends on is how much hazardous waste is generated per calendar month. So usually the rule that we reference kind of under RCRA all the time is that the more you generate, more hazardous waste you generate per month, the more regulations apply. So that's RCRA in a nutshell.
Gotcha. Thank you for that very elaborate and detailed explanation. I think it makes a lot of sense the way you explained the law. So you did touch on this a little bit in regard to like nicotine, but just to clarify, like what is like RCRA's current status for e-cigarette components?
So e-cigarettes are considered hazardous waste under RCRA. And there are two components of the e-cigarettes that make them hazardous waste. That's kind of an unusual aspect to e-cigarettes. So the two components are the e-liquids with the nicotine and the lithium batteries. So let's talk about the e-liquids first. So as I mentioned, nicotine is an acute hazardous waste. And it has been actually since the first RCRA regulations were enacted in 1980. And that's because nicotine is acutely toxic. Interestingly, though, I find this fascinating that nicotine, e-cigarettes weren't around in 1980, right? But yet nicotine is on our list of hazardous waste. And that's because nicotine was actually a widely used pesticide back then. So it's not used as a pesticide anymore, but about the time that those pesticides were getting phased out, nicotine also started being used in over-the-counter nicotine replacement therapies and now e-cigarettes. So anyway, nicotine is an acute hazardous waste. That means the e-liquids that have nicotine in them are also acute hazardous waste. And that's actually true regardless of the concentration of the nicotine. So all e-liquids that contain nicotine are acute hazardous waste. So the other aspect of the e-cigarette that makes it hazardous is the lithium battery. There's lots of different types of lithium batteries, but many of the lithium ion batteries, or even just lithium batteries, are likely hazardous waste for two reasons, actually: ignitability and reactivity. So I think you probably are aware of this without maybe being aware of this, because if anybody's flown in the past couple of years, if you go get on a flight, they tell you that you can't bring lithium battery packs or e-cigarettes in. You can't put them in checked luggage, right? Why is that? Because they have this unfortunate habit of catching fire.
Yeah, I think that unfortunate habit is probably why airplanes would not like some fire, 20,000 feet in the air. But yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I think it's important that people understand why the government does ban certain things, especially when it comes to the airport. I know a lot of people complain about the inconveniences, but knowing why it's banned, I think, can give an appreciation for, why these laws are in place for a reason.
Absolutely.
So you discussed a little bit about how e-cigarette disposal at or just waste disposal in general at residences is not regulated by the EPA, whereas some states might regulate hazardous waste while others do not. Can you elaborate a bit more on the reasoning for this?
Yeah. So like I said, disposal of hazardous waste at residences, including e-cigarettes, isn't regulated by EPA. And that's been the case since 1980 when our first regulations came out. And we did that based on what we read as congressional intent, right? So Congress writes RCRA, the law, and then EPA writes the regulations that implement that. But we looked at the congressional intent and we thought that they did not want to regulate household hazardous waste. So I've always assumed that that was more of a practical consideration than anything else. I mean, how do you regulate what every household disposes, right? But that said, we refer to it as household hazardous waste, right? It's still hazardous. So even though we don't regulate it, we strongly recommend that individuals use what we refer to as household hazardous waste collection programs. And those programs will manage the waste as hazardous waste for you, right? So usually those programs are run by your county or your municipality. And really, they've got an interest. They run landfills, right? They don't want hazardous waste in their landfills, right? So they're going to divert that waste out of their landfills and manage it as hazardous waste for you. And it's free for residents to participate. Now, remember, I mentioned earlier that RCRA allows states to be more stringent. And some states are, in fact, more stringent when it comes to household hazardous waste. So some states, California is the most notable, regulate residences that generate hazardous waste, right? So most states don't, but some states do. Some states regulate the household hazardous waste once it's been collected. So, if you and I throw it away, it wouldn't be regulated, but once a program collects it, then that does become regulated in some states. And then some states also have extended producer responsibility laws, EPR laws, that require manufacturers to fund the collection of hazardous products. And when they reach their end of their useful life. So there are EPR laws for many, many household products. I'm not aware of any for e-cigarettes at this point, though.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. So yeah, we definitely talked about like hazardous waste produced by households and how a lot of that just like practically like can't be regulated. I mean, how do you like regulate like 350 plus million households in the United States, right? But I guess on a more individual level, what are some things people can do to lessen the impact of cigarette use in the environment?
Yeah, I think that's an awesome question. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Because there are several things that I can think of easily that individuals can do, right, to help in this regard. So the first one is that e-cigarettes have lithium batteries, we just talked about, right? So if possible, recycle that lithium battery. So when it comes to batteries, removable batteries are recyclable batteries, right? So battery recyclers are only accepting those batteries that have been removed from e-cigarettes. They don't want the whole post-consumer, the entire e-cigarette, right? They just want the batteries. So I just want to caution though, when I say recycle the battery, do not put the lithium battery in your blue curbside recycling bin. Okay, that's not the method of recycling of lithium battery. Fires caused by lithium batteries we just talked about, that's actually been a really big concern for the waste management industry. Their trucks catching fire and their sorting locations catching fire is a big problem for them. So lithium batteries need to be segregated and from routine trash and recycling. Okay. So if the e-cigarette is designed to have a removable battery, remove that battery and then tape the terminals of each battery or put the battery in a separate plastic baggie, like a Ziploc baggie. Okay. And then bring that lithium battery to a drop-off location that accepts them for recycling. So household hazardous waste collection programs will accept lithium batteries, and some big box stores will also sponsor battery collections. Then once you've removed that battery, the rest of the e-cigarette can actually go to the DEA drug take-back days. Those happen twice a year, the last Saturday of October and the last Saturday of April. And they'll take the remainder of the e-cigarette. They won't take the battery, but they'll take the remainder of the e-cigarette. Okay, so that's the first thing, is recycle the battery. The second is if the lithium battery is not removable, then bring the whole entire e-cigarette to household hazardous waste collection, where again, they'll manage as hazardous waste for you. So word of caution here, okay, only remove the batteries from the e-cigarette if the e-cigarette is designed to have the battery removable. Okay? Do not attempt to remove a battery from an e-cigarette if it's not designed to be removable. Okay, so you probably damage the battery if you do, and a damaged lithium battery is actually the most dangerous type of lithium battery and the most likely to catch fire. Remember, don't put the e-cigarette with the lithium battery in your household trash or the curbside recycling bin. So the third thing people can do to help lessen the impact of the environment on the environment is do not pour or flush the e-liquids down the drain. Okay. There are only three things that you should flush down the drain. Those are referred to as the 3 Ps: pee, poop, and paper. Why only those three things? Stuff that you put down the drain, whether you flush it or pour it down the sink, they travel on their way to the wastewater treatment plant. The wastewater treatment plants, those are designed to remove the 3 Ps. They're not designed to remove other things like pharmaceuticals. Okay, so the wastewater treatment plant, they treat the wastewater and then they discharge the effluent to surface water, which is, a nearby stream or nearby river, right? And that means that if you're flushing contaminants that the wastewater treatment plant is not designed to remove, then those contaminants can enter the environment through the effluent. And then the fourth thing that I think people can do to help lessen the impact on the environment is that we can all recognize that we as consumers have options. Okay, so make smart consumer choices when you purchase e-cigarettes, or for that matter, any other item, right? Take note of whether that battery is removable from the e-cigarette. Now, I will note that since there's the ban on flavors in pod-based e-cigarettes, since that went into effect, the only way to get flavored e-cigarettes is now from single-use disposable e-cigarettes. And that means the battery is not removable, which means it's not recyclable. Okay, so look for purchases where the battery is removable, because that means the battery is recyclable.
All right. Well, thank you so much for elaborating on all of that. Especially like talking about the differences between different e-cigarettes and like the different like disposal patterns that you need to like abide by. I am also a huge advocate of being an informed consumer, so I appreciate you also touching on that. Well, that wraps up Kristen's portion of the Q&A. Thank you so much, Kristen. And now we're going to go ahead and move to some more lobbying and legislation related questions with Miss Allison. So, Allison, are any organizations or states trying to enact legislation to stop tobacco industry or the tobacco industry from further harming the environment?
Yeah, I think as Kristen mentioned, and thanks for having me, as Kristen mentioned, California right now is really the one that's on the forefront in terms of really looking at this piece. There's been, I think there's been several attempts in terms of what has happened with cigarette waste in the environment, right? So making sure we have smoke-free beaches and things like that in terms of the litter of cigarettes. E-cigarettes, I think, because of their, though they've been around for a number of years now, I think people are just trying to figure out how to dispose of that, how to kind of tackle that. What's the piece of that? I know here in Massachusetts, when there's cleanup days, the e-cigarette cartridges are the most that people find. And a lot of times those are around kind of waterways and things where there is some concern on it. I think people have kind of looked at how do you maintain that. But as Kristen mentioned earlier, I think the disposal of the hazardous waste is really complicated, and it's not an easy kind of piece to say, okay, well, you need to dispose of this. There are states that have obviously kind of household disposal requirements for other products. So it has been done, but I think we haven't seen anything widespread across the United States on this issue. But I'm sure that will probably be the next piece.
Yeah, fingers crossed a new national program eventually kicks into place. So yeah, to elaborate more on the regulations, is it possible to incorporate regulations against the tobacco industry in like hopes of bettering the environment in bills addressing climate change?
I mean, I definitely think that there's, as public health has worked more closely over the last couple of years with kind of climate and the idea of kind of those pieces of it and thinking about how are we best to be able to partner on that. I do think that there is opportunity there. What that looks like is a little bit more challenging. Again, it is probably around the disposal of it and in terms of that. But I think that's probably the best, but we haven't seen anything yet. There's always opportunity. So people have ideas, bring them forward, I would say.
Yeah, whenever I think of like, these kinds of acts, like big climate change acts, I always think of like those that like bundle in like other priorities. And so I was wondering maybe if like there are like ideas maybe to like bundle in like these priorities in with larger bills to hopefully like, get more, I guess, votes or I guess more like, priority behind it. Is that maybe like what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, you have an opportunity as you look at something large, right? And whether that's in the state level or the federal level, as you think about how do we tackle it from different angles, that's certainly something from a lobbying standpoint and an advocating standpoint that's always helps, right? The more more things that you bring into it, the more support you get across the board, right? So someone might like the environmental piece, some people might like the fact that there's a public health aspect to this. And so you might gain different support on that. I think the challenging piece is what is it to tackle, right? And how does it get combined? And I don't know that anybody has that issue right now. From the Heart Association standpoint, we still work, on kind of the three big ones, which is really around making sure the taxes are high enough so that makes access an issue, making sure that we eliminate flavors across the board, as there's only a handful of states that have done that in municipalities, and then making sure that the program itself in the states are well funded so people can be educated around this. We have had less in kind of the environmental space from the Heart Association standpoint, but I definitely think as we think about the factors of that, right? And so, we've concentrated a lot around smoke free, so making sure the indoor spaces are. what is the effects in terms of outdoor spaces for climate in those pieces? And I don't know that we have that answer right now.
No, absolutely. I think it's just also interrelated that eventually at some point we're all gonna have to consider like these different like moving puzzle pieces, for lack of a better word. Yeah, so the last
Definitely.
question. Yeah, sorry about that. But the last question I kind of have for you is just what is lobbying in general? And like, do you think the tobacco industry is lobbying against reform to better the environment?
I would not put anything past the tobacco industry. They are a very strong force in lobbying. And so lobbying really just means making sure, and it can look in many different forms, right? It can look as a big corporation like a Philip Morris who puts millions of dollars against making sure that they are not regulated and to be able to get their product back on the market, right? So that might mean that, they want to do everything in their power to make sure they continue to have smokers, right? And so they come up with new products and to try to get through loopholes that currently exist. I wouldn't doubt that they're looking at how do they, they would challenge anything that came up that would hurt their product or their sales of their product, or making any changes to their product to help kind of address any of those environmental concerns that come up. Anyone can lobby or advocate. I think lobbying sometimes gets a bad rap, right? Because people think about the millions of dollars that corporations put behind to lobby against causes that people believe are good. But on the other side, you have folks that put a lot of money or effort behind lobbying for causes that are good and supportive. And so I think, it's really just about how do you stand up? How do you use your voice to an issue that you care about? And I think in particular, this generation has really been very vocal and really strong about climate change and the environment and making sure that the world is left for them and for their children in a better spot. And I think that's where you've seen such progress in terms of people actually now saying, oh, we need to do something. I wish maybe that had happened, years earlier, but I think the power behind the lobbying and the advocating is what you're seeing now, right? And so getting a powerful group of individuals that maybe not from maybe not from a corporation, but really all coming together to fight one cause is really what's important.
Yeah, I agree. I think lobbying isn't necessarily like can be characterized as like good or bad. It's just a tool to further advocacy. It just depends on what cause you're championing, and I guess for lack of a better word.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a piece of the kind of legislative process, right? Like if you're a lawmaker or you're a staff member, or you're a regulatory body or you're an agency, you can't be an expert on all things, right? It's just impossible. And so lobbying plays a role in terms of being able to bring an issue forward, educating about that issue, being an expert in that issue, and being able to be that resource. And I think that's why it has such an important part, whether that's as an individual or an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the illuminating conversation. And that is all we have for today. So Allison and Kristen, do you have anything else you would like to share?
No, I would just say, if there's causes that you care about, look for, an organization that can help support you. That's the easiest way to kind of advocate and give you tools, and then kind of join forces on this.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much to the both of you. We loved hearing from you, and thank you again to our listeners. We hope you enjoy this discussion, and be sure to be on the lookout for more political patient episodes coming soon. Thank you all.